No one expected it, not in that setting, not from him. But in front of a global audience and a hall thick with royal tradition, Prince George made a choice that shook the very walls of the monarchy. Senior royals were left reeling, protocol was shattered, and now, everyone is asking, what does George know that we don't? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with the weight of 1,000 years pressing down on a single moment, an ancient rite meant to reaffirm the unbroken line of royal succession, carefully choreographed, rehearsed, and refined to maintain the illusion of timeless order. The sacred ceremony, cloaked in grandeur and solemnity, was never meant to provoke surprise. But then came the silence, the kind that doesn't follow tradition but interrupts it. Prince George, third in line to the throne, stepped forward at a point where his role should have been purely symbolic. There were gasps, audible in the cavernous hush of Westminster Abbey, when he raised his voice deliberate, clear, and unshaken. It wasn't a tantrum, nor a whisper of confusion. It was a refusal. He objected to a specific passage in the ancient oath, one binding future heirs to unwavering obedience in matters of royal loyalty. The moment sent a jolt through the senior ranks. Queen Camilla stiffened, her gloved hands tightening around the edges of her ceremonial script. Prince William's face betrayed nothing, but those close to him later described a flicker of fear in his eyes. Princess Anne leaned forward, her posture shifting as if to intervene. And then there was Catherine, calm but watchful, seen moments earlier, whispering intently to George, her hand briefly resting on his shoulder as though bracing him for what he was about to do. The officiant faltered, stumbling over his next line, while the gathered guests, royals, dignitaries, and global leaders sat in frozen disbelief. Centuries of tradition unraveled in seconds. And while the room struggled to recover, it became clear. This was no accident. Prince George knew exactly what he was doing. His words, his timing, his refusal. It wasn't the outburst of a child, but the calculated defiance of an heir who understood the consequences. And as palace aides rushed to the altar, and whispers turned into shocked murmurs, a single truth hung heavy in the air. The monarchy had just been challenged from within. But to understand why Prince George made such a bold move, we have to look at the immense pressure building around him behind palace walls. Behind the polished photos and carefully curated public moments lies a very different reality. One where Prince George is being groomed under suffocating expectations, with whispers of a divided future already forming around him. From the moment he could walk, the weight of the crown was placed not on his head but on his every step. Prince George has spent his childhood between two clashing worlds, the warmth and instinctive protection of his parents, and the relentless machinery of the monarchy that expects him to embody duty decades before he can even define it. Behind palace doors, his calendar has grown unnaturally full. Education, protocol, history not just of the nation, but of every misstep of his predecessors. Leaked documents reveal that ceremonial preparations, once reserved for teenage heirs, have already begun for George 5 years ahead of schedule. Sessions with etiquette trainers, meetings with royal advisors, even briefings with historians hand-picked to reinforce the legacy of his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. But inside these heavily orchestrated sessions, something began to shift. George, once compliant and curious, started asking questions that rattled his handlers. According to a close aide, these weren't the musings of a child, they were the reflections of a mind trying to breathe beneath centuries of inherited pressure. And as his father, Prince William, sought to balance George's freedom with royal responsibility, the palace leaned harder in the other direction. Advisors reportedly warned that the boy must be hardened, calling for reduced family time and increased public exposure. Catherine, watching her son shrink beneath these expectations, began pushing back quietly, shielding him from certain events, whispering words of calm when the pressure mounted, even challenging the narrative of urgency being pushed from above. But the more she resisted, the more the palace pushed. And in the midst of this tug-of-war over his future, George began crafting something in silence, his own sense of right and wrong, of power and restraint. Every stiff wave, every poised photo, hid a mind quietly gathering strength. Centuries of tradition, a sacred ritual passed down from monarch to monarch. And yet, this ceremony so symbolically weighted was the moment Prince George chose to draw a line in the sand. The ceremony was meant to be one of quiet reverence, a continuation of a private legacy started during Queen Elizabeth II's reign, one that emphasized obedience, restraint, and absolute loyalty to the institution above all else. This was not a coronation. It was more intimate, cloaked in secrecy, and known to only a few senior royals and ecclesiastical guardians of royal right. Within the solemn chambers of royal tradition, this ritual demanded three things from its heirs: silence in the face of dissent, loyalty to the chain of command, and obedience to the symbolic voice of the crown. Prince George had rehearsed the lines. He had walked through the motions. Royal clergy had guided him gently, while protocol advisors watched closely for any signs of resistance. But behind those polite nods and quiet acquiescence, something had already shifted. George had been uneasy in the days leading up to the event. He'd asked questions, not just about the words, but about their meaning. What did loyalty above self truly require of him? What if silence wasn't noble, but dangerous? Those present during his final rehearsal say he paused before the pledge, his voice faltering for a second too long, his eyes darting toward his mother. Catherine, many believe, had already sensed the coming storm. She knew her son wasn't defiant out of rebellion, but conscience. And when whispers of George's hesitation began echoing through palace corridors, advisors moved swiftly to muffle the noise. They labeled it nerves, a child's instinctive fear of grandeur. They dismissed it, and in doing so, overlooked the strength of the storm that was building within him. Because on the day of the ceremony, when the moment came for George to speak, he didn't falter. He stood tall and said everything by refusing to say one crucial line: "I vow to preserve the silence of the crown over my own voice." That was the line. The line he refused. Instead, he paused and uttered, "Not if silence means hiding the truth." The words weren't loud, but they struck like thunder. Gasps swept across the chamber. The officiating clergy froze. Prince William's expression tightened. Queen Camilla's lips parted in stunned disbelief. And Princess Anne, always the sentinel of protocol, appeared motionless, as though the weight of what had just occurred couldn't yet be processed. George, however, remained still, his shoulders squared, his eyes calm. He had spoken and broken the very oath meant to bind him. And in that fracture, the monarchy itself trembled. But what George said, and more importantly refused to say, ignited a chain reaction of shock, fury, and introspection throughout the royal ranks. With the eyes of the monarchy locked on him and the cameras rolling, Prince George uttered a phrase no royal heir has ever dared to say aloud. And in that instant, he rewrote the unspoken rules of succession. In the most sacred moment of the ceremony, with tradition weighing heavy in the air and history demanding silent obedience, Prince George did what no royal child had done before. As the officiant began to recite the line, one that countless heirs had repeated without question, George interrupted. Without raising his voice or breaking composure, he stated with unwavering clarity, "I will not say that." Gasps rippled through the chamber like a tidal wave. It was as though time had stopped. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Camilla's reaction was instant, her face drained of colour, and she gripped the side of her seat, whispering frantically to the aide beside her. Prince William's face remained stoic, as he'd likely trained it to be, but a closer look revealed a clenched jaw and twitch of the brow that betrayed the storm beneath his royal mask. Princess Catherine, seated nearby, reached out in one subtle, instinctive motion, her hand resting protectively on her son's arm. The message was clear. She was standing with him, not against him. The officiant looked around in alarm, clearly waiting for instruction. The sacred words hung in the air, unspoken and now shattered. For 3 long minutes, the ceremony halted. Silence gave way to murmurs. Palace advisors quickly huddled off to the side, flipping through ceremony protocols, Scanning for any precedent, there was none. They weren't prepared for this. They had trained George to obey. They had rehearsed every line, every movement. But they hadn't trained for defiance, rooted not in tantrum, but in awareness. This was not a child rebelling. It was a prince making a decision. What made it more explosive was the dignity in George's stance. His refusal was not disruptive, it was deliberate. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't confused. He was certain. And everyone watching could feel it. Something profound had just broken loose inside the monarchy. The rules that had bound generations together under layers of inherited silence had just been questioned publicly by the very future of the throne. The oath remained unfinished, the ritual unsealed, the tension unbearable. All of it live, all of it unplanned. And still, George did not waver. What gave him that resolve? What made him so sure of his decision that he'd risk igniting the fury of the most powerful family in Britain? But George's resistance wasn't just emotional, it was informed, because days before, he uncovered something that changed how he saw the ritual forever. Buried in the documents George was handed to study ahead of the ceremony was a clause no modern royal had questioned until now. And once he read it, there was no turning back. Prince George was expected to prepare diligently for the sacred ceremony. To most, it was a formality, a generational handover of symbolic duty. But to George, who had quietly begun to view the monarchy through his own lens, it was more than that. As he sat with the annotated ceremony script weeks before the event, something caught his attention. It wasn't bolded. It wasn't flagged. But it was there. A clause tucked beneath the surface of the traditional pledges. The heir shall maintain unquestioned obedience in matters of legacy. The words struck him like cold steel. Unquestioned. Obedience. Legacy. It wasn't guidance. It wasn't vision. It was surrender. And for a boy born into duty but raised by a mother who champions mindfulness and a father who once longed for modernization, it didn't sit right. George didn't panic. He asked, quietly, calmly. One evening, after the day's briefings, he approached his mother. "What does it mean that I can't question legacy?" Catherine froze. Not in fear, but in recognition. She knew the weight behind that clause, knew what it had done to those before him. Her reply was soft, but her face was described by staff as unnerved. She didn't offer him a rehearsed explanation. She didn't tell him to ignore it. She simply said, "Some traditions are built to protect, but not all of them protect you." That answer, as poetic as it was, only fueled George's curiosity. He began asking more questions, not aloud, but internally. If he was destined to lead, why must he silence his voice? If he was the future, why was the past dictating every breath of it? It wasn't rebellion, it was clarity. And when he confided in a trusted aide, a senior staffer who had once served under Queen Elizabeth, the reply came with a warning. Tread carefully. The system sees hesitation as defiance. George didn't respond with fear. He responded with resolve. He knew that to walk blindly through a ceremony that stripped him of personal agency was to set a precedent he couldn't walk back from. So he made a decision, one that would shake the institution not with fire, but with the most dangerous act a royal heir can make conscious objection. The night before the ceremony, he rewrote that line on a private draft of the script. Not with red ink, not crossed out, but replaced entirely. He wrote, "The heir shall be guided by purpose, not silence." That version never made it to the altar, but the message had already taken root. But George wasn't interested in careful. He was interested in change, and soon another royal began quietly supporting him. While the palace tried to contain the fallout, one figure remained curiously calm: Princess Charlotte. What she said to George before the ceremony may have given him the courage to stand his ground. In the whirlwind that followed George's unprecedented defiance, the palace fixated on damage control advisors scrambled, optics were dissected, and whispers swirled through the corridors of power. But amid the chaos, one person stood remarkably composed. His younger sister, Princess Charlotte. Known for her sharp instincts and unwavering presence even at such a young age, Charlotte's influence on George may have been quiet, but it was seismic. The night before the ceremony, staff reported seeing the two siblings walking the private garden paths alone, an unusual occurrence during such a tightly scheduled evening. There were no aides, no parents, just Charlotte and George, in what one insider described as a moment of eerie stillness before the storm. When pressed, a palace staffer admitted hearing a phrase from Charlotte that would later echo through the events of the next day. "If you feel it's wrong, don't say it." Simple, unpolished, but profoundly defiant for a child raised behind palace gates. Charlotte didn't offer strategy. She offered truth, a truth that George, already torn between obedience and conviction, clung to in the hours that followed. Their bond, forged in the shadows of responsibility, became his last moment of clarity before walking into tradition's tightest grip. And afterward, when the cameras caught Charlotte's fleeting glance toward her brother mid-ceremony, it wasn't random. It was confirmation. A silent message exchanged between siblings navigating a kingdom that wasn't built to nurture dissent. Later that night, a royal nanny, unaware of the looming scandal, overheard George whisper, "Thank you, Lottie," as they crossed paths in the corridor. It wasn't loud, it wasn't performative, but it was loaded. That thank you wasn't just for advice, it was for courage, for kinship, for knowing that even in the loneliest act of resistance, he wasn't alone. And the palace noticed. An internal memo leaked days later warned that both George and Charlotte should be observed more closely, moving forward an indication not just of concern, but of caution. The system doesn't fear youthful rebellion. It fears calculated unity. Charlotte didn't take the spotlight, but her influence burned through every decision George made. Their alliance, forged without titles or authority, may be the most disruptive force the modern monarchy has yet to reckon with. But not everyone in the royal household saw George's act as brave. One senior royal viewed it as an outright threat. In a private corridor, just moments after the ceremony ended, Princess Anne reportedly unleashed a furious tirade that left staff rattled. The moment the ceremony drew to its stunned conclusion, tension didn't dissipate, it detonated. Princess Anne, the unwavering enforcer of royal tradition, marched through the hushed corridor with a resolve that shook the palace to its core. For decades, she had been the monarchy's iron backbone, silent in public, formidable in private, and this moment was no exception. Ignoring protocol, she intercepted Prince George before he could even return to his suite. What followed was not a gentle word of guidance, but a fiery confrontation that stunned nearby staff. Witnesses described her voice as low, but cutting. She didn't mince words. She demanded to know what had possessed him, to defy centuries of ritual in front of the world, and whether Catherine had been quietly fueling rebellion from the nursery. It was more than accusation. It was an indictment of 20T, parenting, of influence, of intent. George, though visibly shaken, did not back down. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, but he didn't apologize either. Instead, he simply said, "She leaned into the doctrine that has guided her every royal step, unity above self, duty above doubt. To her, the crown survives not through emotion, but endurance. And what George had done, she warned, was not an act of courage, but of fracture. Catherine, reportedly just steps away, did not intervene. But William did. And when he stepped between his aunt and his son, it was not with hostility, but resolve. He didn't raise his voice either, but the message was unmissable. Enough. The silence that followed was thicker than any ceremony pause. Anne turned sharply and left, but not before delivering a final blow, declaring that the royal household needed to conduct a full disciplinary review into what she called the breakdown of ceremonial order. Those words weren't about a boy, they were about a system. And now, lines were being drawn within the palace walls. Generational divides once kept hidden behind polite gestures were exposed, raw, and bleeding. But even as Anne demanded consequences, another figure was quietly watching, weighing, and preparing to speak. Because what came next wasn't fury, it was something far more unexpected. But while Anne demanded punishment, King Charles made a decision no one saw coming. Hours later, with the world waiting for condemnation, King Charles shocked everyone by issuing a brief but loaded statement. In the spirit of growth, tradition must evolve. With that, he signaled something profound. As dawn broke over a monarchy still reeling from the storm of shattered ceremony, a single piece of paper changed everything. Released without the usual pageantry of palace procedure or the sign-off of senior advisors, King Charles's statement arrived not with thunder, but with precision. In just 47 words, he dismantled assumptions, silenced calls for punishment, and introduced something even more unsettling to royal traditionalists: admiration. Admiration for a child who had defied centuries of obedience. Charles didn't just forgive George, he framed his actions as a necessary spark in the evolving arc of royal duty. "Conviction without arrogance," he wrote, "is the rarest gift in leadership. And today, my grandson reminded me of the power of conscience." The statement made no mention of Princess Anne's fury, of the internal calls for inquiry, or of the silent war that had begun to brew between old and new guards. Instead, it closed with a haunting reference. As Her late Majesty taught us, tradition is not stone, but soil. It must be tilled, or it dies. With those words, Charles reached across generations, aligning George's defiance not with rebellion, but with legacy. And just like that, the narrative shifted. What had been a scandal was rebranded as awakening. Media outlets that had spent the previous evening speculating about royal discipline suddenly pivoted. Headlines across the globe hailed George not as a rogue prince, but as a visionary in waiting. Social media flooded with praise, calling him the voice of a generation trapped in robes of silence. The statement didn't just spare George, it elevated him. And in doing so, Charles cracked open the monarchy's most sacred vault, the illusion of unshakable permanence. This wasn't a king weakened by illness or scandal. This was a monarch, very much aware of time, choosing legacy over rigidity. Yet even in the praise, unease lingered. If a 12-year-old heir could reshape protocol, what else might change? What might be lost in the name of evolution? And for those in the palace who spent lifetimes guarding against change, the king's words landed like thunder in disguise. Because once the gates of reform are opened, even just an inch, there's no telling what might pour through. But even as the dust settles, a deeper question remains. Has Prince George just become the architect of a new kind of crown? This was more than a defiance. It was a statement. As Prince George rewrites what it means to be royal, the world must ask, can the crown evolve with him, or will tradition break before it bends? What began as a jolt in the heart of sacred ceremony has now rippled outward into the foundations of monarchy itself. In the weeks following Prince George's unprecedented stand, the palace aides have scrambled behind gilded doors, while the nation and the world have begun asking if the future king's actions marked the first real turning point of a new royal age. One immediate consequence. The royal education program is under quiet but comprehensive review. Insiders reveal that Prince George's private curriculum is being restructured entirely, with Catherine and William personally overseeing what some are calling the heir education reformation. It's no longer just about knowing lineage and Latin, it's about developing a voice, understanding consequence, and recognizing the emotional burden that comes with ceremonial power. This isn't a boy being shaped by the throne. It's a throne learning to bend toward the boy. Meanwhile, in stark contrast to George's rising presence, Queen Camilla has made a strategic retreat from public appearances. Palace sources insist it's for rest, but timing suggests otherwise. After being visibly rattled during the ceremony, and notably absent from subsequent public engagements, Camilla's silence has only deepened speculation. Her influence, once steady behind palace walls, now appears diminished. Princess Anne, on the other hand, remains defiant in her traditionalist stance, though even she has not denied that George's conviction forced a reckoning overdue. While her disappointment remains evident, a growing whisper among her staff suggests she may finally be seeing that control without evolution is no longer sustainable in a modern monarchy. And if Anne, the crown's unflinching iron spine, is shifting even slightly, then nothing within the House of Windsor is immovable. Outside the palace, the public response has been seismic. Polls across the UK and Commonwealth reveal overwhelming support for George, particularly among younger demographics who view his actions as courageous rather than careless. For the first time, one commentator noted, the future of the monarchy doesn't feel like a relic, it feels like a revolution. Newspaper editorials, once deferential to rigid protocol, now call for reform. Royal analysts, once content with ceremonial repetition, are demanding transparency. And through it all, Prince George has remained remarkably quiet. No statements, no follow-ups, but his silence speaks volumes. Because unlike the pomp that once defined monarchy, this moment feels driven not by gold leaf and velvet, but by something far more human: conviction, conscience, and the courage to break silence in a room that rewards obedience. This is the monarchy's challenge now, not just to survive the tremor, but to understand it. To decide whether its legacy lies in resisting change or in learning to evolve with grace. Because the truth is no longer cloaked in tradition. It stood in a cathedral, looked into the eyes of kings and queens, and said, "No." And in that moment, history bent perhaps forever. And so, as George steps into a future few dared to imagine, the monarchy watches in silence, aware that history has already been altered. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.